when Canadian soldier Major George Buch arrived in the Croatian village of Medoc in September 1993 with orders to establish a United Nations peacekeeping position. He had no idea that within 72 hours he would be standing between Serbian forces and the complete erasure of a civilian population, or that his decision to disobey direct orders to retreat would save hundreds of lives, while his own government would spend the next 2 decades trying to bury the story of what happened there. The Battle of the Medoc Pocket remains one of the most significant but least known engagements involving Canadian forces since the Korean War. A 15-hour firefight where fewer than 200 Canadian soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, held their ground against a force that outnumbered them and outgunned them. Standing firm while ethnic cleansing unfolded just beyond their position, this story begins not with heroism but with betrayal. In a village where families had lived for generations, where Muslims and Croats had been neighbors and friends, and where the disintegration of Yugoslavia had transformed those neighbors into executioners and victims in a pattern of violence that the international community had proven utterly unable or unwilling to stop. The village of Medoc sat in the Krina region of Croatia, territory that had become a battlefield in the complex dissolution of Yugoslavia that began in 1991. The region was claimed by both Croatia and Serbian forces, and the civilian population found itself trapped between competing nationalist movements that had transformed multi-ethnic communities into killing grounds. By September 1993, the pattern had become grimly familiar. One side would launch an offensive to capture territory. Civilian populations would be targeted for ethnic cleansing. Atrocities would be committed. And by the time international forces arrived to investigate, evidence would be destroyed and perpetrators would deny everything. The United Nations had deployed peacekeeping forces throughout the former Yugoslavia. But these forces operated under restrictive rules of engagement that often left them as witnesses to atrocities rather than protectors of civilians. Canadian soldiers deployed as UN peacekeepers found themselves in impossible positions, tasked with keeping peace where no peace existed and protecting civilians while lacking authority or support to actually intervene when violence erupted. Major George Buch was a career infantry officer who'd joined the Canadian forces in the 1970s and had served in various capacities, including training exercises with NATO forces. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the situation he encountered in Croatia. The 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, known as the 2PPCLI, had deployed to Croatia as part of the UN Protection Force in the spring of 1993, taking over positions in Sector South where they monitored ceasefire lines between Croatian and Serbian forces. The ceasefires were routinely violated. Both sides accused the other of aggression, and the UN forces found themselves simultaneously distrusted by both parties and dependent on the cooperation of the very forces they were supposed to be monitoring. Buch's company had established observation posts and patrol routes, documenting violations and filing reports that seemed to disappear into unbureaucracy without resulting in any meaningful action to stop the violence. The Croatian offensive that would lead to the Battle of the Medoc Pocket began on September 9, 1993, when Croatian army units launched Operation Medoc Pocket, an attack designed to push Serbian forces out of a salient of territory they controlled. The offensive was swift and violent, with Croatian artillery pounding Serbian positions while infantry advanced supported by tanks and armored vehicles. Serbian forces, which included both Yugoslav army units and local Serb militias, fought back but were gradually pushed from their positions. Caught in the middle were the civilian populations of several villages including Medoc, Divoselo, and Pozitelj, small communities where Serb families had lived for generations and where the approaching Croatian forces represented an existential threat. Intelligence reports that reached Canadian positions indicated that this wasn't just a military operation, but an ethnic cleansing campaign. That Croatian forces were systematically destroying Serbian villages and targeting civilians. But confirming these reports required getting into the area. which Serbian forces were preventing and which Croatian forces certainly weren't going to allow. Major Butch received orders on September 15 to prepare his company to move into the Medak area as part of a UN mission to verify that Croatian forces were withdrawing as they'd agreed to do under a ceasefire arrangement brokered by UN officials. The ceasefire stipulated that Croatian forces would pull back to positions they'd held before the offensive, and that UN peacekeepers would occupy the zone to prevent further fighting. Butch's company, consisting of approximately 150 soldiers from the 2 PPCLI, along with some French mechanized units, assembled at their base and prepared to move into what everyone knew was a dangerous situation. The soldiers loaded ammunition, checked their equipment, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that their rules of engagement allowed them to use force only in self-defense, which meant they could be fired upon but couldn't respond aggressively, a restriction that made them targets rather than combatants in any meaningful military sense. The convoy that entered the Medak pocket on September 15th encountered resistance almost immediately. Croatian forces, which were supposed to be withdrawing, were instead still present in the villages and actively engaged in systematic destruction. As Canadian soldiers approached Medak, they could see smoke rising from burning buildings. They could hear gunfire and explosions. They could smell the distinctive odor that soldiers learned to recognize: burning flesh. The Croatians had established roadblocks and were preventing UN forces from entering, claiming they needed more time to secure the area before peacekeepers could take up positions. This delay was allowing Croatian forces to complete their ethnic cleansing operation, to destroy evidence of atrocities, and to ensure that no Serbian civilians remained alive in the territory they were supposed to be transferring to UN control. Major Butch faced a decision that would define the rest of his life and save hundreds of lives. He could follow standard procedure, which would mean waiting at the roadblock while Croatian forces finished whatever they were doing in the villages. Or he could push through and establish positions despite Croatian opposition. The safe choice, the choice that would avoid conflict and keep his soldiers out of danger, was to wait. But Butch understood that waiting meant people were dying, that every hour of delay allowed more atrocities to be committed, and that the entire purpose of unpeacekeeping would be rendered meaningless if peacekeepers simply stood aside, while ethnic cleansing happened in front of them. He made the call to push through, to use the threat of force to get past Croatian roadblocks, and to establish Canadian positions in the villages. Regardless of Croatian protests, what Butch's company encountered as they entered Medak was a scene of systematic destruction that shocked even soldiers who'd been in Croatia for months and had seen the aftermath of violence before. Every house had been burned, not by accident or collateral damage, but methodically torched to ensure nothing remained habitable. Livestock had been shot and left to rot in fields. Wells had been poisoned or filled with debris. Orchards had been cut down. Churches had been demolished with explosives. This wasn't the aftermath of a battle. It was deliberate erasure, the kind of thorough destruction that takes time and organization. That requires people to move from building to building with fuel and matches. That represents a conscious decision to ensure that the people who'd lived here could never return. Among the ruins, Canadian soldiers found bodies, Serbian civilians who'd been shot, some showing signs of torture, some who'd clearly been executed at close range. The number of bodies was relatively small, perhaps 16 that could be immediately located. But the absence of the civilian population that should have been present in these villages suggested that hundreds had fled or been killed and their bodies hidden. The Croatian forces that were supposed to be withdrawing responded to the Canadian presence with hostility. That quickly escalated into armed confrontation. Croatian soldiers, many of them drunk and aggressive, began firing on Canadian positions, initially small arms fire that seemed designed to intimidate rather than kill, but gradually escalating to heavier weapons, including mortars and anti-tank weapons. The Canadians had taken up defensive positions in the ruins of Medak, establishing a perimeter that prevented Croatian forces from continuing their operations, but that also made the Canadians targets for Croatian anger. The rules of engagement that restricted Canadian soldiers to defensive fire only created a tactical nightmare. because it meant they had to absorb fire and identify hostile intent before they could respond, giving attackers first-shot advantage that could be fatal. The firefight that erupted on the night of September 15th to 16th lasted approximately 15 hours and involved intensity of combat that Canadian forces hadn't experienced since Korea. Croatian forces launched multiple attacks on Canadian positions using small arms, machine guns, mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, and anti-tank weapons. The Canadians responded with disciplined defensive fire, using their training and superior night fighting capabilities to hold positions despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Corporal Mike Ralph, whose account was documented in military after-action reports, described the surreal experience of watching tracer rounds arc through the darkness toward his position, hearing the impact of mortar rounds, and returning fire at muzzle flashes while trying to maintain fire discipline and avoid escalating the situation beyond what rules of engagement allowed. The sound was overwhelming, the fear was constant, and the confusion was total, but the Canadians held their ground. The command decisions made by Major Butch during this firefight demonstrated both tactical skill and moral courage that would later be recognized, but that in the moment simply felt like survival. When Croatian forces attempted to flank Canadian positions, Butch redeployed platoons to cover the threat. When ammunition began running low, he coordinated resupply under fire. When soldiers were wounded, he ensured they received medical treatment while maintaining defensive positions. And when headquarters radioed orders to withdraw, to pull back, and avoid further confrontation, Butch made the decision to ignore those orders. He understood that withdrawing would allow Croatian forces to complete their ethnic cleansing operation, would abandon Serbian civilians who might still be hiding in the area, and would send a message that peacekeepers could be intimidated into abandoning their positions. So he stayed, and his soldiers stayed with him, fighting through the night to hold positions in a destroyed village while their own command structure ordered them to retreat. The courage of individual Canadian soldiers during this battle deserves recognition because these were young men, many in their early 20s, who found themselves in combat that their training had prepared them for technically, but that nothing could prepare them for emotionally. Private Scott LeBlanc, 19 years old and on his first deployment, described in later interviews how he joined the military expecting peacekeeping to mean distributing supplies and helping refugees, not fighting a pitched battle against forces that were supposed to be complying with a ceasefire. LeBlanc and soldiers like him performed with professionalism and bravery that belied their youth and inexperience, following orders, maintaining fire discipline, and protecting each other through hours of sustained combat. Several Canadians were wounded during the engagement. Injuries from shrapnel and small arms fire that required medical evacuation, but remarkably none were killed despite the intensity of fire they endured. The dawn of September 16 brought a gradual reduction in fighting as Croatian forces realized that the Canadians weren't going to be intimidated into withdrawing, and that continued. Attacks risked escalating the situation in ways that might bring international condemnation. The ceasefire that had been negotiated before the battle finally began to hold, with Croatian forces pulling back from their forward positions and the Canadians maintaining control of the villages. As daylight illuminated the area, the full scope of the destruction became visible. Medak and the surrounding villages had been thoroughly destroyed. Hundreds of buildings reduced to smoking ruins, infrastructure demolished, and the landscape transformed from living communities into graveyards. Canadian soldiers began the grim work of searching for bodies, documenting the destruction, and trying to piece together what had happened to the civilian population, the bodies that Canadian soldiers found in the days following. The battle told stories of atrocities that were difficult to process and impossible to forget. Elderly people who'd been shot in their homes, women who showed signs of sexual violence before being killed, bodies that had been mutilated after death. One particularly haunting discovery was a well that contained multiple bodies of civilians who appeared to have been thrown in after being executed. Master Corporal Matt Stopford, who participated in the body recovery operations, would later describe the psychological toll of this work, explaining that the smell, the sights, and the knowledge that these were innocent civilians who'd been murdered for nothing. More than their ethnicity created trauma that would affect him for the rest of his life. The Canadian soldiers photographed and documented everything they found, creating evidence that would later be used in war crimes tribunals. But in the moment, they were simply witnesses to evil, trying to ensure that the victims wouldn't be forgotten.